Well, look, this has always been about investigation, not confrontation, and the government's been quite strong on that. But we have a duty of care to our country and as a good global citizen to those 300,000 souls that have lost their lives to ask legitimate questions about what we can learn from this and the actions of WHO, but also we in the Agriculture Department are now asking the global community to look at wildlife wet markets. We've led the way on that in asking constructively, let's have dialogue. 6 pandemics since 1980 have originated from wildlife wet markets. They are different to normal wet markets. These have wildlife in them that have seen these pandemics originate. And it's important we understand the science behind that so we can make decisions and work with those nations to protect one another and to protect agricultural production systems.
Is there such a thing as a safe wildlife wet market?
Well, if off the advice of the Australian Chief Veterinary Officer, I would suggest not. And he is, in fact, the president of the World Organisation for Animal Health, which is the peak international body. But what we want to do is not force our will, but to understand with investigation, bringing the best and brightest from around the world to understand the risks that they pose and can they be mitigated. Now, if they can't, how do we phase them out and just get back to wet markets that are important for food security for a lot of these nations? And in fact, they're important here in Australia. The Sydney fish market's a perfect example.
Right.
Quite safe, but when you add wildlife into that, you expose animals and humans to this pandemic risk. And those are the questions that we want to calmly and methodically work through with the best and brightest in the world.
So this inquiry will get an answer to that. Can you safely have wildlife wet markets? If the answer is no, Australia has to be part of a group of countries that make sure China obeys what wouldn't be necessarily a directive, but just the interests of world health. How hard would we push on that?
Well, let me just differentiate, Tom. What is going to the World Health Assembly is more around the treatment of officials and how we've handled the pandemic itself. What we asked at G20 from the Department of Agriculture of our G20 partners was to investigate wildlife wet markets. China, quite rightly, originally identified this as the cause of the pandemic and notified the WHO, but also the World Organisation for Animal Health. So it's our responsibility to lead that and ask the questions. And in fact, China themselves have a strong history of participating with the World Organisation for Animal Health. We are working with that organisation for not just China, because you've got to understand they exist not just in China, but in other continents as well as Asia, and to get an understanding. So that's why we've calmly and methodically through Mark Chip, the Chief Veterinary Officer and the Chairman of the World Organisation for Animal Health, to lead that on Australia's behalf, and we are calmly and methodically working through with other nations to get that understanding. This other piece that we have also led is around the management of COVID-19. And again, Australia has simply asked questions around how this has originated, how we've handled it, what can we do better? The world's got a lot smaller. We've got to understand we're a smaller global community and we interact a lot more. We've got to protect one another and we've got to be responsible to one another, and simply making learnings from this will be very important for us as a global community to move forward. And Australia should proudly say we're the first ones to stand up and ask the question.
Simon Birmingham's not getting his phone calls returned. Your counterpart in Beijing has said there isn't an opportunity to talk in the near future. This sounds like a pretty broken relationship.
With all due respect, what they've obviously also said is that they believe that these issues around barley and also beef are being worked through constructively by our officials. And in fact, the feedback I get from the Department of Agricultural officials in Beijing is exactly that it's very constructive on the ground, working with Chinese officials in Beijing, answering their questions. We hope that will then be able to move into...
Well, what do you take, though, from the fact that ministers can't talk to their counterparts in Australia? What does that mean to you?
Well, we obviously continue, both Simon Birmingham and I, continue to keep an open door policy to continue to enrich the dialogue, to be constructive in any misunderstandings, and we'll continue to do that. Now, we can only do that from our perspective, and we continue to put our hand out. And if the Chinese officials, ministry officials want to reach out to us, our door is always open and our phone is always on. And we want to work through this But we take them on face value that they're confident that officials can work through these issues constructively. And from the feedback,
but what about the face value of them not picking up the phone, refusing to have conversations? That must mean something.
Well, I think you can speculate all you like. Obviously, we're all at different stages of dealing with COVID-19 and recovering from COVID-19. And you have to take on face value that they are working through their recovery phase as we speak. And I take the Agricultural Secretary's perspective on that from China and respect that, and respect also the fact that they are working constructively with us in Beijing. We will continue to make ourselves available, and I think to speculate would be dangerous and unwise.
What's your message to farmers out there right now watching this situation, whether it be barley, beef or other speculated things that Australia is trying to sell to China in particular? What's your message on where this might end up and any alternative plans you might have or be able to help them with if there is an issue with selling them to China?
Well, we've already started that with the trade agreements that we put in place, not just with China, but Korea, Japan, the TPP-11, a $13.2 trillion marketplace that those on the other side of the aisle said, don't bother, can't happen, all too hard. Now an Indonesian trade agreement that starts on the 5th of July. Our job is to put the environment around our farmers, to give them the opportunity to spread their risk, their market risk, and that's what we've done. And we've got to then allow our farmers, our exporters, to make those determinations themselves. And in fact, I'm very proud of the way the agricultural sector has addressed this issue. They haven't panicked. They've simply worked through this calmly and methodically. They've looked at their market risks, and they continue to look at the opportunities that we as a government have provided to them. And they're the ones that make decisions. Okay. Government should make decisions for businesses. That's dangerous.
So on diversification, because this is such a big topic at the moment, whether or not we're too reliant on China, there's going to be no mandating from government on being less reliant. It's just about opening up other avenues and hoping, is it, that farmers and other groups, miners and so on, diversify themselves?
Well, that's just basic good business principles. Market concentration for any business is dangerous, and that's why you look at your market concentration and you spread that risk. The government shouldn't have to make those determinants on businesses. They make those decisions themselves. And in fact, some of the abattoirs that I've worked to that have talked to about this particular issue have already diversified some of their base. Others not as much as they'd like. But those are why our job as a federal government is to provide the environment to give them the opportunity to send boats left and right into other markets. And that's what we've done, calmly and methodically with these other trade agreements, getting them market access. And we're pretty proud of the fact that we're giving them the opportunity to send boats left and right instead of up the centre. Given
the language we're hearing out of China at the moment, are some of these suppliers seeing China as a less reliable trading partner?
No, less reliable than any other. The reality is that there are strict rules around trade. The WTO administer them, and when there's a disagreement, you go to the umpire. And Australia has a record of doing that.
But you could also get these technicalities, right, with the beef exports, and they can put a hold on things pretty easily without contravening these WTO rules. Doesn't that make them potentially a less reliable partner? We have the same thing with coal shipments, for example.
No, that's why there's a framework in which you enter into that dialogue to make sure that there's an understanding. Nothing's lost in translation, and that we can continue to work through those issues. When that breaks down and where there is a disagreement, well, that's when the umpire comes in. That's the framework that's been put in place that works very comfortably, and I think we should take comfort in that and take comfort in the fact that the Australian government, when we believe that we haven't been understood, that we will take it to the umpire for them to understand and to determine and to make a decision, and we'll do that. We've got a strong record of that, but we believe that dialogue, constructive dialogue, is the best way in which to enrich trade and to enrich relationships without having to do that.